The snow was 3 feet deep across the Montana Valley, but Otto Reinhardt's cabin roof was completely bare, while his neighbor, Franz Brenner, stood on his own roof with a shovel, clearing dangerous weight that threatened collapse. What happened in the months before that moment would change how frontier families survived winter across the entire Northern Territory, and the technique Otto discovered would save dozens of lives over the next 2 decades. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story is even more remarkable than this one. The sound woke Otto Reinhardt at 4:30 in the morning. It was not loud, just a subtle creaking that came from somewhere above his head in the darkness of the cabin. He lay still in his bunk, listening, trying to determine if the sound was worth investigating. Beside him in the other bunk, Wilhelm Kessler continued sleeping, his breathing steady and deep. The cabin was cold, as all cabins were in northern Montana Territory during January, but it was tolerable. The creaking came again, longer this time, almost a groaning sound. Otto sat up slowly, careful not to disturb Wilhelm. It was January 11th, 1873, and they were 6 weeks into what was already proving to be one of the harshest winters either man had experienced in the territory. Snow had fallen almost continuously for 3 days, and the accumulation outside was substantial. Otto had noticed the previous evening that snow was piling up on the cabin roof, but that was normal. Every cabin collected snow. You cleared it when it got heavy enough to be concerning. The groaning sound came a third time, and now Otto recognized it. That was the sound of wood under stress, the protest of logs bearing more weight than they wanted to carry. He swung his legs out of the bunk and reached for his boots in the darkness. He would need to get on the roof at first light and clear some of the snow. Before he could pull his first boot on, the world exploded. There was no warning, no final creak or groan. One moment the cabin was intact, and the next moment the entire southwestern section of the roof gave way with a sound like thunder. Logs, snow, bark, and debris crashed down into the interior. Otto was thrown sideways out of his bunk by the concussive force of the collapse. He landed hard on the packed dirt floor near the door, the breath knocked from his lungs, his ears ringing from the noise. For several seconds he could not move or think. He lay on his side, gasping for air, trying to understand what had happened. Snow was still falling through the massive hole in the roof, drifting down in the gray pre-dawn light that now filtered into the cabin. The air was full of dust and ice crystals. Otto's first coherent thought was for Wilhelm. He pulled himself to his feet, ignoring the pain in his ribs and shoulder where he had hit the floor. The interior of the cabin was chaos. The collapse had brought down approximately 1/3 of the roof structure, and the debris had fallen directly onto Wilhelm's bunk. Logs that had formed the roof frame now lay at violent angles across the sleeping area. Snow covered everything. Otto reached the pile of debris and began pulling away logs and branches with his bare hands. He was calling Wilhelm's name, but he received no response. It took him nearly 10 minutes of frantic work to uncover his friend's body. Wilhelm Kessler was 42 years old, a German immigrant who had come to Montana Territory 5 years earlier. He had been Otto's partner for 3 trapping seasons. He was dead. A roof log nearly 10 inches in diameter had struck him across the chest and head. Death had been instantaneous. Otto sat in the ruins of his cabin as dawn light strengthened, looking at Wilhelm's body, and something fundamental changed in his understanding of survival. Otto buried Wilhelm Kessler on a hillside overlooking their trapline claim on January 12, 1873. The ground was frozen solid, and digging the grave took most of the day. He used a pickaxe to break through the frost layer, then a shovel to remove the loosened earth. The work was exhausting, made worse by the cold and by grief. Wilhelm had no family in the territory. His relatives were still in Germany, and they would never know what happened to him. Otto wrapped the body in a wool blanket and lowered it into the grave as gently as he could manage alone. He covered the grave with stones gathered from the hillside, building a cairn that would mark the location and protect it from animals. There was no minister within 50 miles, so Otto said what words he could remember from funerals he had attended. They felt inadequate. When he finished, he stood at the grave for a long time, looking out across the valley below. That was when he noticed something that would change everything. The hillside where he stood was steep, perhaps 60 degrees or more in places. Snow covered the valley floor and the gentler slopes, but the steepest sections of the hillside were bare. Snow had fallen on them during the storm, Otto knew that, but it had not stayed. The angle was too severe for accumulation. Snow slid off as soon as it landed. Otto looked at the rocky outcrops nearby. The vertical faces were bare. The angled faces, steeper than about 60 degrees, were bare. But every horizontal surface and every gentle slope held deep snow. The pattern was consistent across the entire visible landscape. Steep angles shed snow. Gentle angles collected it. He returned to the damaged cabin as the sun was setting. The interior was uninhabitable. Snow had continued to fall through the collapsed section, and everything was covered in ice and debris. Otto cleared a small space near the fireplace and managed to start a fire more for light than warmth. He sat staring at the ruined roof structure, analyzing what had failed. The cabin had been built using standard frontier construction methods. 4 walls of notched logs, a peaked roof with a ridgeline running the length of the cabin. The roof pitch was typical, about 35 degrees from horizontal. That pitch was steep enough to shed rain effectively, and was easy to build with available materials. Every cabin in the territory used approximately the same design. It was proven, traditional, and adequate for most purposes. But adequate was not the same as safe. Wilhelm was dead because this roof had accumulated too much weight. The 35-degree pitch had allowed snow to pile up until the supporting logs failed. Otto had checked the roof just 3 days earlier and had seen the snow accumulation, but it had not seemed dangerous. He had misjudged the weight, or perhaps the snow had been heavier than normal, or perhaps the logs had a hidden weakness. The specific cause did not matter. The fundamental problem was that the roof pitch allowed dangerous accumulation in the first place. Otto spent that night in the damaged cabin, unable to sleep, staring at the collapsed roof timbers and thinking about angles. Otto Reinhardt was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had attended school through 8th grade in his native Bavaria, before his family immigrated to America when he was 14. He could read and write in both German and English. He understood basic arithmetic, but he had no training in mathematics, engineering, or architecture. What he did have was practical intelligence and an obsessive focus on solving the problem that had killed his friend. He started with observation. Over the next week, while he worked to make the damaged cabin marginally habitable, he studied how snow behaved on every surface he encountered. He watched snow on tree branches. Horizontal branches accumulated snow until they bent or broke. Branches angled steeply shed their load. He examined rock formations. He noticed that certain angles seemed to represent a threshold. Below that angle, snow stuck. Above it, snow slid away. He began experimenting with small models. Using twigs and small branches, he built miniature roof structures at different pitches and watched what happened when snow fell on them. A 30-degree roof held snow. A 45-degree roof held less, but still accumulated significant weight. A 60-degree roof shed almost everything. A 70-degree roof was completely self-clearing. The pattern was consistent and observable. Somewhere between 50 and 60 degrees, there was a critical angle where snow could no longer maintain grip on a surface. Otto did not know the physics behind this. He did not know about friction coefficients or the crystalline structure of snow or gravitational force vectors. But he did not need to know the theory. He only needed to know what angle worked. The problem was how to build a cabin with a 60-degree roof. A standard cabin with walls and a peaked roof could theoretically have very steep roof sections, but the geometry created problems. If you made the roof pitch 60 degrees, the peak would be absurdly high, requiring extremely long logs for support, creating massive, wasted space in the upper portions and making construction difficult. The structure would be unstable in wind. It was impractical. Otto sat in his damaged cabin night after night, sketching designs by firelight on scraps of bark and pieces of leather. He drew standard cabins with various roof pitches and saw immediately why they failed. The roof was a separate element resting on vertical walls. To make the roof steep enough to shed snow, you had to make it enormous. What if the walls and roof were not separate elements? What if the walls themselves were steep enough to shed snow? Otto sketched a circular floor plan with walls angling inward from all sides, meeting at a central point above. The shape was a cone. It looked nothing like a cabin. It looked like the teepees used by native tribes, but built from logs instead of hides. The design seemed absurd at first glance, but as Otto studied his sketch, he realized it solved multiple problems simultaneously. The steep angle would shed snow completely. The conical shape would be structurally strong. The reduced interior volume would be easier to heat. There would be no corners to create weak points, no separate roof structure to fail. Otto spent the remainder of January refining his design and calculating dimensions. In early February 1873, Otto Reinhardt walked 3 miles through snow to visit his nearest neighbor, Franz Brenner. Franz was a fellow German immigrant who had established a claim 5 years earlier and was considered one of the more successful settlers in the region. His cabin was solid, his livestock healthy, and his opinions forcefully expressed. Otto respected Franz's experience and hoped to get advice on his unconventional cabin design. Franz was repairing a harness in his cabin when Otto arrived. He offered coffee and listened as Otto explained what had happened to Wilhelm and described the cabin design he had developed in response. Otto showed Franz the sketches he had drawn, explaining the snow shedding angle, the conical geometry, the circular floor plan, and the structural advantages he believed the design would provide. Franz looked at the sketches for a long moment, then handed them back to Otto. "You want to build a teepee," he said. "A white man's teepee." Otto tried to explain that it was different from a teepee, that it would be built from solid logs with proper chinking and a door and a real fireplace. Franz shook his head. "It looks foolish, Otto. Men will laugh at you. You have lost your friend, and your grief has confused your thinking. Build a proper cabin. Make the roof stronger if you are worried. Use thicker logs, but build something that looks like a cabin." Otto visited Heinrich Stolz next, another settler who lived 4 miles in the opposite direction. Heinrich was younger than Franz, less established, and generally more open to new ideas. But his response was similar. He did not mock Otto openly, but his skepticism was clear. "The design wastes space," Heinrich said, studying the sketches. "A circular floor plan means you cannot use the edges efficiently, and it looks strange. Why would you want to live in something that looks like a child's drawing of a mountain?" Otto tried to explain the snow-shedding properties and the heating efficiency, but Heinrich remained unconvinced. "I understand what you are trying to do," he said, "but there are reasons cabins are built the way they are built. Those methods have been proven over generations. Your design is untested and strange." The most discouraging conversation came with Deacon Ludwig Hartmann, the closest thing the scattered settlement had to a religious leader. Hartmann held services once a month in his cabin, and his opinions carried weight in the community. When Otto showed him the cabin designs, Hartmann frowned deeply. "This seems like pride, Otto," Hartmann said. "The idea that you alone know better than all the builders who came before you. Frontier life requires humility and adherence to proven methods. Departing from tradition out of arrogance or fear invites disaster. Build a standard cabin. Trust in God's protection rather than strange geometries." Otto thanked each man for his time and returned to his damaged cabin. He had hoped for advice, perhaps even assistance. Instead, he had received mockery, skepticism, and warnings about pride. But Wilhelm was still dead, the roof had still collapsed, and the steep hillside still shed snow while the gentle slopes collected it. Otto's observations did not change because other men dismissed them. He decided to build the triangular cabin alone. Otto Reinhardt selected his building site in mid-February 1873. He chose high ground approximately half a mile from the collapsed cabin on a slight rise that offered good drainage and clear sight lines in all directions. Most settlers built near water sources for convenience, but Otto prioritized visibility and elevation. He wanted to see weather approaching, and he wanted his foundation above any potential spring flooding. The first task was marking the circle. Otto cut a cord 18 feet long and tied one end to a stake driven into the center of his selected location. Walking around the stake with the cord pulled tight, he dragged a stick through the snow to mark a perfect circle on the ground. The diameter he had chosen, 18 feet, would provide adequate interior space while keeping the structure small enough to heat efficiently. The circumference was approximately 56 feet, which meant he could space his primary support posts 7 feet apart around the circle. Digging the foundation trench through frozen ground was brutal work. Otto used his pickaxe to break through the frost layer, which extended down nearly 2 feet in some areas. Once through the frost, the digging became easier, but it still required days of steady labor. He dug the trench 1 foot wide and 8 inches deep, following the circular mark he had scribed. The precision mattered. Any irregularity in the foundation would translate into problems in the structure above. He gathered stones from a creek bed a quarter-mile away, hauling them in a canvas sling. The work required dozens of trips over several days. He needed enough stones to fill the entire circular trench, creating a stable base that would distribute weight evenly and prevent settling. He selected flat stones where possible and fitted them together carefully, filling gaps with smaller rocks. The result was a level ring of stone 18 feet in diameter, raised slightly above the surrounding ground. Around the stone ring, Otto planted 8 primary support posts. These posts were critical to his design. He selected straight pine logs, approximately 8 inches in diameter, stripped them of bark, and shaped one end to a point. Using his pickaxe and shovel, he dug holes 3 feet deep at evenly spaced intervals around the circle. He planted each post in its hole, tamped earth around it firmly, then braced it vertically with temporary supports. The posts extended 4 feet above ground level, rising from the stone ring like fence posts around a circular corral. By early March, the foundation was complete. It had taken 3 weeks of solitary labor. Otto stood at the center of his circular stone ring, surrounded by 8 vertical posts, and surveyed what he had built. To anyone passing by, it looked bizarre. There was no indication yet of what structure would rise from this foundation. It simply appeared to be a circular arrangement of posts and stones that served no obvious purpose. Franz Brenner rode past one afternoon, stopped his horse, and stared at the foundation for a long moment. He said nothing to Otto, but shook his head slowly before continuing on his way. The mockery required no words. The logs for the radial framework required careful selection. Otto spent a week in the forest identifying suitable trees. He needed logs that were straight, approximately 6 to 8 inches in diameter, and between 14 and 16 feet long. Each log would span from the outer stone ring to the central apex point, and any significant curve or irregularity would create problems in the final structure. He cut 24 logs initially, dragging them to the building site using a rope harness. The work was exhausting. Each log weighed between 150 and 200 pounds, and the snow made dragging difficult. But Otto worked steadily, accumulating his materials before beginning the actual construction. The first log placement was critical. Otto positioned one end on the stone foundation ring and angled the other end upward toward where the central apex would be. approximately 14 feet above the ground. The angle was steep, approximately 65 degrees. From horizontal, he braced the log temporarily with supports, then began placing additional logs around the circle. The spacing was crucial. Otto had calculated that logs placed 18 inches apart around the circumference would create adequate coverage while leaving gaps small enough to fill with secondary logs later. He worked his way around the circle methodically, placing each log with one end on the stone ring and the other end angling toward the central point. The structure began to take shape. From outside, it resembled an enormous wooden teepee. The logs converged toward a central point high above the ground, creating a cone shape that looked nothing like any cabin in the territory. Otto ignored the strangeness of the appearance and focused on the geometry. The steep angle was what mattered. By the time he had placed 16 logs evenly spaced around the circle, the basic framework was visible. The gaps between logs were wide, but Otto had planned for this. He would fill them with shorter secondary logs, creating a complete shell. The primary logs formed the structural skeleton. The real challenge came at the apex. All the logs needed to meet at a single central point, and that junction needed to be strong enough to support the entire structure's weight. Otto had developed a solution during his weeks of planning, but implementing it required precision carpentry. He had prepared a central hub, a circular disc cut from a massive pine trunk. The disc was 3 feet in diameter and 6 inches thick. It weighed nearly 90 pounds. Around the edge of the disc, he had cut 24 notches at precise intervals, each notch 3 inches deep and shaped to accept the end of a radiating log. Getting the hub into position required ingenuity. Otto built a temporary scaffold at the center of his circle and hoisted the hub into place using a rope and pulley system. Once positioned at the correct height, he began fitting the ends of his radiating logs into the notches. Each log end was shaped to fit snugly. Once fitted, Otto drilled holes through both the log and the hub, then drove wooden pins through to lock them together. The work was slow and demanding, but when he finished, the result was solid. The central hub distributed weight from all 24 logs evenly. The entire structure was locked together at the apex in a way that could not fail without destroying the hub itself. With the primary framework complete, Otto turned his attention to filling the gaps between the main radiating logs. These gaps were approximately 18 inches wide at the foundation circle and narrowed to nothing as the logs converged toward the apex. Simply placing logs in these gaps would not work. They would have no support and would slide down over time. Otto needed a system to lock the secondary logs into place. His solution involved creating a diamond pattern. Between each pair of primary logs, he placed 2 secondary logs that crossed each other, forming an X shape. The lower ends of these secondary logs rested on the stone foundation ring, offset from the primary logs. The upper ends met the primary logs at points approximately 6 feet up from the ground. Otto notched both the primary and secondary logs at these intersection points, creating joints where they locked together. The notching required precision. Each notch needed to be cut to exact depth and angle so the logs would fit together tightly. Otto used a handsaw and chisel, working carefully to avoid splitting the wood. Once notched, he fitted the secondary logs into place and secured them with wooden pegs driven through pre-drilled holes. The pegs locked the secondary logs to the primary logs, creating a rigid triangulated structure. He worked his way around the entire circumference, installing 2 secondary logs between each pair of primary logs. The pattern created visual interest, but more importantly, it created structural redundancy. If any single log developed a crack or weakness, the surrounding logs would continue supporting the load. The structure was not dependent on any individual component. Above the 6-foot level, the gaps between logs became narrow enough that Otto could fill them with single short logs rather than crossed pairs. These upper sections were fitted and pegged using the same careful notching technique. By the time he reached the area near the apex, the gaps were so narrow that he filled them with split wood wedges driven between logs to seal the remaining spaces. The complete log shell took 5 weeks to construct. When finished, the structure consisted of 48 major logs, all interlocked and pegged together, converging at the central hub. From a distance, it looked like a solid wooden cone. Up close, the diamond pattern of crossed logs was visible, creating a texture that was both functional and distinctive. Otto walked around the exterior, inspecting every joint and checking every peg. The structure was rigid. When he pushed on any individual log, nothing moved. The interlocking system had created a unified whole rather than a collection of separate pieces. He climbed the temporary scaffold and pushed on the central hub from below. It did not shift. The weight distribution was working as he had calculated. Franz Brenner visited again during this phase, along with Heinrich Stolz. They walked around the structure slowly, examining the unusual construction. Heinrich asked about the crossed log pattern, and Otto explained the triangulation principle. Franz said nothing, but his expression made his opinion clear. The structure looked strange, perhaps even crude. It certainly did not look like a cabin, but it was undeniably solid. Standard frontier cabins used mud or clay chinking between logs to seal gaps and prevent drafts. The material was readily available and easy to apply, but Otto recognized immediately that standard chinking would not work on his steeply angled walls. Mud applied to a 65-degree surface would simply slide off before it dried. Even if it initially adhered, the first rain would wash it away, or temperature changes would cause it to crack and fall. Otto needed a chinking material that would adhere to steep surfaces, remain flexible through temperature extremes, provide insulation, and resist water penetration. He spent 2 weeks experimenting with different mixtures, testing small batches on scrap wood angled at the same pitch as his cabin walls. His first attempts failed. Pure clay slid off. Clay mixed with grass dried but cracked immediately. Clay mixed with sand had no adhesive properties. He tried pine pitch alone, but it was too brittle when cold and too soft when warm. Each failure taught him something about what properties the mixture needed. The solution came from combining multiple materials. Otto started with clay as the base, mixing it with water until it reached a workable consistency. To this he added pine resin that he had collected and boiled down from sap. The resin provided adhesive properties and water resistance. He mixed in dried grass cut into short lengths, which reinforced the clay and prevented cracking. Finally, he added rendered animal fat from deer he had hunted. The fat made the mixture more pliable and helped it resist freezing. The proportions mattered. Too much resin made the mixture too sticky to work. Too little made it weak. Too much grass created a loose texture that would not seal properly. Otto adjusted the ratios through trial and error until he achieved a consistency that could be pressed firmly into gaps between logs, would adhere to the wood even at steep angles, and would dry to a firm but slightly flexible seal. Preparing the chinking mixture was labor-intensive. Collecting pine resin required finding trees with active sap flow and scraping the sticky substance into containers. Boiling it down to concentrate it took hours over a fire. Rendering animal fat required hunting, butchering, and slow heating to separate fat from tissue. Preparing enough mixture to seal all the gaps in his cabin took 3 full days of work. Otto applied the chinking from inside the cabin, working section by section. He packed the mixture into the gaps between logs using a wooden paddle, pressing it firmly to ensure good contact with the wood surfaces. The mixture was sticky and difficult to work with, but it stayed in place even on the steep walls. He worked carefully, sealing every gap he could find, knowing that each unsealed space would become a source of heat loss and drafts during winter. The dried chinking created a seal that was both waterproof and insulated. When Otto pressed on it after it cured, it had a slight give but did not crack or crumble. It bonded to the wood so firmly that removing it would require scraping with a blade. Rain ran off the surface without penetrating. The mixture had worked exactly as Otto hoped. A circular structure with walls angling inward at 65 degrees presented unique challenges for door placement. Standard cabins had vertical walls with rectangular door frames mortised into adjacent logs. Otto's cabin had no vertical surfaces and no corners. Every point on the circumference was structurally identical. He needed to create a door opening that would not compromise the structural integrity of the cone while providing adequate access and security. Otto's solution was to leave a 3-foot gap in the lower section of the log framework. He positioned this gap facing south for maximum sunlight exposure and aligned it between two of his primary structural logs. The gap extended from ground level to approximately 6 feet high, large enough for a man to enter comfortably while standing upright. Building the door frame required careful carpentry. Otto cut 2 straight logs to serve as vertical door posts, each shaped to match the inward angle of the surrounding walls. He mortised these posts into the stone foundation at the bottom and connected them to the adjacent structural logs at the top using notched joints secured with wooden pins. The posts became integrated parts of the structural framework rather than additions that weakened it. The door itself was Otto's most complex single component. He started with thick planks hewn from a single pine log, selecting the densest, straightest-grained wood he could find. Each plank was nearly 3 inches thick and shaped to precise dimensions. He assembled them using tongue and groove joints, each plank interlocking with its neighbors, to create what was effectively a single solid piece. Because the door needed to fit an angled frame, Otto shaped it to match the inward slope of the wall. The exterior face of the door was angled to sit flush with the cone's surface when closed. This required beveling the edges of each plank at precise angles, work that took 2 full days to complete properly. He reinforced the door with iron brackets salvaged from his collapsed cabin, mounting them diagonally across the interior face in an X pattern. The brackets were bolted through the planks using square-cut nails he had purchased in town the previous fall. The result was a door that weighed approximately 70 pounds, but was rigid and immensely strong. The hinges presented another challenge. Otto mortised heavy iron hinges into both the door and the doorpost, cutting rectangular pockets that the hinge plates sat in. He then bolted them through using iron pins. The hinges could not be torn free without destroying the wood they were embedded in. But Otto added a feature that would prove crucial during harsh weather. 6 inches behind the main door, he built a second interior door from lighter planks. This created an air gap between the 2 doors, a space that would trap air and serve as thermal insulation. The double door system meant that even when the outer door was sealed against blizzard conditions, the interior remained protected by 2 barriers and an insulating air layer. On extremely cold nights, Otto could seal both doors and retain significantly more heat than a single door system would allow. The locking mechanism used a heavy wooden beam that slid horizontally through brackets, connecting the door to the adjacent wall structure. When engaged, opening the door would require tearing out the entire wall section. The central hub where all 24 primary logs converged was structurally sound, but it presented a critical vulnerability. The junction point, despite being carefully constructed, had small gaps between the log ends where they met the hub. These gaps were unavoidable given the limitations of hand tools and natural variations in wood. Rain or snow could penetrate these gaps, and over time, moisture would rot the wood and compromise the entire apex structure. Additionally, Otto needed a way to vent smoke from his fire while maintaining the option to seal the apex completely during extreme weather. The solution required designing a cap that could cover the entire hub area, provide weatherproofing, and incorporate a controllable vent opening. Otto began by creating a conical cap framework from bent wood strips. He soaked thin strips of ash wood in hot water until they became pliable, then bent them around a form, to create a cone shape approximately 4 feet in diameter at the base and rising to a point 18 inches above the hub. He secured the bent strips with leather ties and allowed them to dry in position, creating a rigid conical framework. Over this framework, he layered wooden shingles in an overlapping pattern, starting at the bottom and working toward the apex. Each shingle was hand-split from cedar, chosen for its natural water resistance and durability. The shingles overlapped like fish scales, each layer covering the gaps in the layer below. He attached them to the bent wood framework using small wooden pegs, creating a weatherproof surface that would shed rain and snow. The apex of the cap featured Otto's ventilation innovation. At the very top, he left a circular opening approximately 8 inches in diameter. Over this opening, he constructed a smaller secondary cone that sat on short posts, creating a gap between the inner and outer cones. Smoke could rise through the central opening and escape through the gap, but rain or snow falling from above would hit the outer cone and run down its surface rather than entering the cabin. The entire cap structure was designed to be removable. It sat on the central hub without being permanently attached, held in place by its own weight and by wooden guides that prevented lateral movement. Otto could lift the cap off completely if he needed to work on the hub or if he wanted maximum ventilation during warm weather. But during winter storms, the cap created a complete seal over the apex. He added one final refinement. Around the base of the cap where it met the hub, he applied his clay resin chinking mixture, creating a flexible seal that accommodated minor movements while preventing air and moisture penetration. The seal could be broken and reapplied whenever he needed to remove the cap. Testing the ventilation system required building a fire in the central pit. Otto lit a small fire and watched as smoke rose naturally toward the apex, passed through the central opening, and escaped through the gap in the double cone system. The draw was excellent. Smoke did not accumulate in the interior. When he reduced the fire to coals, almost no smoke was visible, yet the ventilation continued to function, drawing fresh air from the door area and exhausting it at the apex in a natural convection pattern. With the structure fully enclosed and weatherproofed, Otto turned his attention to the heating system. He had observed during construction that the conical geometry created natural air circulation patterns, but he needed to design a fireplace system that would maximize heat retention and distribution throughout the interior space. Most frontier cabins used stone fireplaces built against one wall with chimneys extending up through the roof. This design worked adequately, but was inefficient. Much of the heat escaped through the chimney and the warmth concentrated near the fireplace, while areas far from the fire remained cold. Otto's conical structure offered an opportunity for a more effective approach. He built his fire pit at the exact center of the circular floor plan, directly beneath the apex opening. The location was deliberate. Heat rises naturally, and by placing the fire at the center, Otto ensured that warm air would rise directly to the highest point of the cone where the ventilation opening was located. But before that warm air could escape, it would spread outward along the sloped ceiling, warming the entire upper portion of the interior. The fire pit itself was surrounded by stones gathered from the creek bed and carefully selected for their ability to withstand heat without cracking. Otto arranged them in a circle approximately 4 feet in diameter, building the walls up about 1 foot above the floor level. The stones served multiple purposes. They contained the fire safely, they absorbed heat during burning, and radiated it back into the room for hours after the fire died down, and they provided a stable base for cooking implements. Around the stone circle, Otto created a larger cleared area where sparks or coals could fall without igniting anything. He covered this area with sand and flat stones, creating a fireproof zone that extended 3 feet in all directions from the fire pit. Safety was paramount. A cabin fire in winter could be fatal. The genius of Otto's system revealed itself in how air circulated. Cold air entered through small gaps around the door at floor level. This cold air was denser than warm air and flowed naturally toward the center where the fire was located. The fire heated this incoming air, causing it to rise toward the apex. As it rose, it spread outward along the sloped walls, warming them. The warmed air then gradually cooled and descended along the walls back toward the floor, where it was drawn again toward the center fire and reheated. This continuous circulation meant the entire interior space was heated relatively evenly. There were no cold corners far from the fire. The conical shape and central fire location created a natural convection system that required no additional mechanisms or complexity. Otto simply needed to maintain the fire, and the geometry of the structure distributed the heat. He tested the system during a cold night in late March. With a modest fire burning, the interior temperature was comfortable throughout. He could sit anywhere in the cabin and feel warmth. The stone fire pit continued radiating heat for hours after the flames died, maintaining temperature through the night. Otto had created a heating system that was both efficient and effective, using nothing more than careful placement and an understanding of how warm air behaves in enclosed spaces. Otto completed his triangular cabin in early November 1873, 9 months after Wilhelm's death. The structure stood solid and strange on its hilltop location, a cone of logs rising 14 feet above the stone foundation ring. Franz Brenner had stopped commenting on it, though his skepticism remained obvious. Heinrich Stoltz had visited twice during the final construction phases, asking technical questions that suggested his interest went beyond mere curiosity. But mostly, Otto had worked alone, and he now lived alone in his unconventional shelter. The first significant snowfall came on November 19th. Otto woke before dawn to silence, the particular quality of quiet that comes when snow is falling heavily. He could not see outside in the darkness, but he knew from experience what was happening. He added wood to the coals in his central fire pit and waited for daylight. When dawn came, Otto opened his exterior door and looked out at a transformed landscape. Snow covered everything. The valley below was white. The trees wore heavy mantles of snow on their branches. The ground showed at least 8 inches of accumulation, and snow was still falling steadily. It was the kind of snowfall that would have worried him in his previous cabin, the kind that required getting on the roof with a shovel to clear dangerous weight before it became critical. Otto walked around his cabin slowly, examining the exterior walls. The steep conical surface was completely clear. Not a single flake of snow had adhered to the log surface. Everything that fell slid off immediately, leaving the wood bare and visible. The steep angle he had calculated and built was performing exactly as he had predicted. Snow could not accumulate on a 65-degree surface. It simply slid down and piled at the base. He walked the quarter-mile to Franz Brenner's cabin through the deepening snow. Franz was already on his roof with a wooden shovel, clearing. Accumulation. The work was difficult and potentially dangerous. One slip on the snow-covered roof could result in a serious fall. Franz had to clear the snow to prevent the weight from becoming dangerous, but clearing it required climbing onto the already loaded roof. Franz saw Otto approaching and paused his work. He looked across the valley toward where Otto's triangular cabin was visible in the distance. Even from a quarter-mile away, the bare wood surface was obvious. Franz's roof, like every other roof in the territory, was white with snow. Otto's roof was the color of pine logs. Franz said nothing. He returned to his shoveling, but his expression had changed. The mockery was gone. In its place was something that might have been grudging respect or possibly jealousy. Otto had built something that worked. Over the next week, the snow continued intermittently. Total accumulation reached 14 inches on level ground. Otto never touched his roof. He never needed to. Every flake that fell on the steep conical surface slid off within seconds. He spent his days inside the warm cabin, maintaining his fire, organizing his supplies and watching through the small windows he had installed as snow continued to fall on a structure that refused to hold it. December brought cold that tested both cabins and inhabitants. By mid-month, temperatures were dropping below zero regularly at night. On December 18th, the temperature fell to 20 degrees below zero, one of the coldest nights Otto had experienced in Montana territory. This was the kind of cold that killed. Men had frozen to death in their cabins when fires went out or when structures failed to retain heat adequately. Otto maintained a steady fire in his central pit throughout the day, using his carefully gathered firewood at a measured rate. He did not build the fire large. The interior space of his conical cabin was relatively small compared to rectangular cabins of similar floor space. The reduced volume meant less air to heat. By evening, the interior was comfortable enough that Otto could remove his heavy coat. He had no thermometer to measure the exact interior temperature, but he used practical indicators. Water in his bucket did not freeze. His breath was visible, but not the thick fog that indicated extreme cold. He could sleep comfortably under wool blankets without needing to wear all his clothes. These signs suggested the interior was maintaining temperature well above freezing despite the extreme conditions outside. 2 days later, Otto encountered Franz Brenner at the settlement's small trading post. Franz mentioned casually that his water bucket had frozen solid the previous night despite maintaining a fire. He had woken to find frost on the interior walls of his cabin near the corners. The cold had penetrated his structure in ways that made sleeping difficult and dangerous. Otto asked about Franz's firewood consumption. Franz estimated he was burning nearly twice what he normally used, trying to keep his cabin warm enough to survive the cold snap. Otto was using approximately half what Franz described, yet maintaining more comfortable conditions. The difference was substantial. Over a full winter, Otto's reduced firewood needs would mean significantly less time spent cutting and hauling wood, which in turn meant more time for other survival activities. The explanation was simple geometry and physics. Franz's rectangular cabin had a large interior volume with high walls and a peaked roof. Heat rose to the peak and remained trapped in the upper space far above where Franz slept. The corners of rectangular cabins were notoriously difficult to heat because the logs created air gaps that allowed cold to penetrate. Franz needed a large fire to heat a large, inefficient space. Otto's conical cabin had a much smaller interior volume despite having a similar floor space. The sloped walls meant there was no wasted space high above the living area. Heat from the central fire rose to the apex, then spread along the sloped walls and descended in a continuous circulation pattern. The circular floor plan eliminated corners where cold could penetrate. The result was a space that stayed warm with a modest fire. Heinrich Stoltz visited Otto's cabin during the cold snap, ostensibly to borrow some tobacco, but his real purpose became clear when he spent nearly an hour inside, asking questions about the heating system and the firewood consumption rate. Heinrich was calculating. His own cabin was struggling with the cold, and he was burning through his firewood supply faster than he had anticipated. Otto's cabin was noticeably warmer despite the smaller fire. The blizzard arrived on January 8, 1874, 13 months after Wilhelm's death. Otto had been watching the sky for 2 days, seeing the signs that any experienced frontiersman recognized. The particular quality of light, the behavior of animals, the feel of the air all indicated that severe weather was approaching. He spent January 7th gathering extra firewood and securing his supplies inside the cabin. The storm hit at dawn. Wind came first, gusting hard enough to shake even solid structures. Then the snow began. Not the gentle fall of earlier storms, but a horizontal driving assault of ice crystals propelled by wind that screamed across the Montana landscape. Visibility dropped to nothing within minutes. The world outside Otto's door became white chaos. Otto sealed both his exterior and interior doors, creating the insulated air gap he had designed into the entry system. He built up his central fire and settled in to wait. There was nothing else to do. In a blizzard of this magnitude, going outside meant death. Men had frozen 10 feet from their cabin doors, disoriented by whiteout conditions and unable to find their way back. The wind noise was extraordinary. It howled around the conical structure with a sound unlike anything Otto had heard in rectangular cabins. But the sound was smooth, continuous, not the buffeting and rattling that came when wind hit flat surfaces and corners. The wind flowed around the circular structure rather than slamming into it. Otto could feel no movement in the logs, no shaking or trembling. The structure stood absolutely solid. For 3 days the blizzard continued. Otto maintained his fire, rationed his supplies, and waited. The interior remained comfortable. The double-door system prevented drafts. The apex ventilation system continued to function, drawing smoke from his fire even though wind was howling outside. Snow did not enter through the vent because of the double-cone design he had built into the cap. On the morning of January 11th, the wind finally stopped. Otto waited until full daylight, then opened his doors. The world outside was transformed. Snow covered everything to a depth of approximately 3 feet on level ground. Drifts were considerably deeper. Trees had broken under the weight of snow and ice. The landscape looked alien and dangerous. Otto walked around his cabin, examining it carefully. The conical surface was bare. 3 feet of snow had fallen during the storm, and none of it remained on his walls. It had all slid off as it landed, accumulating in a circular drift around the base of the structure, but leaving the logs themselves completely clear. He did not need to clear his roof because there was nothing on it to clear. He made his way through deep snow to Franz Brenner's cabin, concerned about his neighbor's welfare. He found Franz alive, but shaken. A section of Franz's roof had partially collapsed under snow weight during the storm's second night. Franz Brenner's roof damage was not catastrophic, but it was serious enough to require immediate repair. The collapse had occurred in one corner where snow accumulation had been heaviest. Several roof support logs had cracked under the weight, and a section of the bark and sod roof covering had fallen into the interior. Franz had been sleeping on the opposite side of the cabin and was not injured, but the experience had terrified him. Otto spent 2 days helping Franz make temporary repairs, using spare logs to shore up the damaged section and covering the hole with canvas and additional bark. The work was difficult in the extreme cold and deep snow, but it was necessary. Franz could not survive another major storm with his roof compromised. During those 2 days of repair work, Franz asked questions. He asked how Otto's cabin had performed during the blizzard. He asked about the snow-shedding angle and the structural strength of the conical design. He asked about firewood consumption and interior temperature. His tone was different now. The mockery was gone completely. In its place was genuine interest and perhaps a measure of embarrassment about his earlier dismissiveness. Otto answered every question honestly and completely. He explained the geometry that made snow slide off steep surfaces. He described the central hub system that distributed structural loads evenly. He talked about the reduced interior volume and how it improved heating efficiency. Franz listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification on technical details. On the evening of the second day, as they finished the temporary repairs, Franz said something that surprised Otto. "If I build another cabin, I will build it your way," Franz said. I was wrong to laugh. Heinrich Stoltz appeared at Otto's cabin in late February. Unlike Franz, Heinrich had not experienced a roof collapse, but his cabin had developed serious problems with ice dams and interior frost. Cold air had penetrated through gaps in his chinking and around his corners, creating frost on the interior walls that melted during the day and froze again at night. The cycle was damaging his stored supplies and making the cabin increasingly unlivable. Heinrich asked if he could examine Otto's construction in detail. Otto agreed, and spent an afternoon showing Heinrich every aspect of the design. He explained the foundation ring, the radial log framework, the central hub, the chinking mixture, the double door system, and the apex ventilation. Heinrich took notes on scraps of paper, sketching details and recording dimensions. "I have enough logs to build a new cabin," Heinrich said. "Would you object if I used your design?" Otto felt no possessiveness about his innovation. "Build it however you think best," he said. "If this design helps you survive winter, then use it." Heinrich began construction in early April, as soon as the ground thawed enough to dig. He built his triangular cabin 3 miles from Otto's location on a hillside overlooking a different valley. Otto visited twice during construction to offer advice, but Heinrich did most of the work independently. By late October, Heinrich had a completed conical cabin that closely resembled Otto's original. The winter of 1874 to 1875 saw 3 more triangular cabins built in the region. Carl Zimmerman, a trapper who worked territory north of the settlement, built one in a remote location after hearing about the design from Heinrich. Deacon Ludwig Hartmann, who had initially warned Otto about pride and departing from tradition, quietly built a small conical structure as a storage building and was impressed enough by its performance that he planned a full-sized cabin for the following year. Lorenz Bohm, a recent arrival to the territory, heard about the design from multiple sources and sought out Otto specifically to learn the construction techniques. Otto spent a week helping Lorenz lay out his foundation circle and establish the primary framework. Lorenz completed the rest independently, creating his own variations in the interior layout while maintaining the essential conical geometry. Not everyone adopted the design. Franz Brenner repaired his rectangular cabin and continued living in it, though he reinforced the roof structure substantially. Several other settlers dismissed the triangular design as unnecessary or too labor-intensive. The traditional rectangular cabin remained the dominant architecture in the region. But a growing minority recognized the advantages of the conical approach, particularly those who had experienced roof failures or struggled with heating efficiency. The practical benefits became increasingly obvious through direct comparison. During heavy snowfalls, rectangular cabin owners spent hours on their roofs with shovels, while triangular cabin owners watched snow slide off automatically. During cold snaps, rectangular cabins consumed firewood at rates that strained winter supplies, while triangular cabins maintained comfortable temperatures with modest fires. The difference in firewood consumption alone was significant enough to make the design worthwhile. Carl Zimmerman's experience became a frequently repeated story in the region. During a week-long blizzard in February 1875, Carl was trapped in his remote triangular cabin with limited supplies. The storm was severe enough that several trappers in the region died, caught in the open, or in inadequate shelters. Carl survived comfortably. His cabin shed snow continuously throughout the week, maintained warmth with his limited firewood, and remained structurally sound despite extreme wind and snow loading. When Carl returned to the settlement in spring and described his experience, it influenced several people who had been skeptical about the design. Survival stories carried weight on the frontier. A shelter that had kept a man alive through conditions that killed others was worth serious consideration. By 1876, approximately 8 triangular cabins existed in the broader region. The design was spreading organically through word of mouth, practical demonstration, and the simple fact that it solved real problems that frontier settlers faced. Otto Reinhardt had never promoted his innovation or sought recognition for it. He had simply built something that worked, and people who needed similar solutions were adopting it. In December of 1876, a surveyor named Thomas Whitmore passed through the settlement while conducting a territorial survey. Whitmore was educated, methodical, and carried instruments that most frontier settlers had never seen. Among his equipment was a set of precision thermometers manufactured in Philadelphia, capable of measuring temperature with accuracy that frontier inhabitants could only estimate through practical observation. Whitmore had heard about the unusual conical cabins in the region and was curious about their performance. He was a man who appreciated innovation and enjoyed collecting data. When he met Otto Reinhardt at the trading post, he asked permission to conduct temperature measurements comparing the triangular cabin to standard rectangular construction. Otto agreed, interested to see it. His observations about heating efficiency could be quantified. Whitmore selected a particularly cold day for his experiment. On December 21st, the winter solstice, exterior temperature dropped to 12 degrees below zero. Whitmore visited Franz Brenner's repaired rectangular cabin first, taking measurements at different locations within the interior. Franz had a substantial fire burning, consuming firewood at the rate Franz considered normal for extreme cold. Whitmore recorded interior temperature of 34 degrees Fahrenheit at the center of the cabin, with colder readings near the corners and ceiling. He then visited Otto's triangular cabin, where Otto maintained what he considered an equivalent fire, similar wood consumption rate, and similar heat output. Whitmore placed thermometers at multiple locations within the conical interior. The readings were remarkably consistent. The central area near the fire measured 62 degrees. Locations along the sloped walls measured between 58 and 60 degrees. Even the areas farthest from the fire showed temperatures above 55 degrees. The difference was dramatic and undeniable. With equivalent fires burning equivalent amounts of wood, Otto's triangular cabin maintained an interior temperature 28 degrees warmer than Franz's rectangular cabin. Whitmore recorded these measurements carefully in his survey notebook, adding detailed observations about the structural differences between the two designs. He wrote, "The conical cabin design demonstrates remarkable thermal efficiency. The reduced interior volume, absence of corners, and natural convection patterns created by the geometry combine to produce heating performance substantially superior to traditional rectangular construction. The builder attributes the design to observations of snow behavior on natural slopes following a fatal cabin collapse. The innovation represents practical frontier engineering of significant merit." Whitmore shared his findings with both Otto and Franz, showing them the written measurements. Franz looked at the numbers for a long time without speaking. Otto felt no satisfaction in the validation, only a quiet recognition that his observations had been correct. The steep angle that shed snow also happened to create a shape that held heat. Wilhelm's death had led to a cabin design that was simply better at keeping people alive through winter. Whitmore's survey notes eventually made their way into territorial records, though they received no particular attention at the time. They simply became part of the documented observations about frontier settlement conditions in Montana Territory during the 1870s. Otto Reinhardt lived in his triangular cabin until 1889, 16 years after its completion. By then, he had married a woman named Greta who had arrived in the territory as part of a family seeking homestead land. They had 2 children in the conical cabin, a son and a daughter, both of whom grew up thinking their unusual home was perfectly normal. It was only when they visited other families that they realized their cabin looked different from everyone else's. In 1889, Otto and Greta purchased a larger homestead in a valley with better agricultural land. They built a rectangular house there, larger and more conventional, suitable for a growing family and farming operation. The triangular cabin stood empty after they left, solid and weatherproof, gradually fading into the landscape as grass grew up around its stone foundation ring. Travelers occasionally used the abandoned cabin as a way station. Hunters sheltering from storms found it dry and secure. The structure showed no signs of deterioration. The logs remained tight, the chinking intact, the roof still shedding snow as effectively as the day Otto completed it. It simply stood there, functional and forgotten, requiring no maintenance or attention. By the 1890s, approximately 24 conical cabins existed across Montana and Wyoming territories. Some were built by people who had seen Otto's original. Others were built by people who had seen those copies. The design spread through practical demonstration rather than any formal promotion. Frontier builders who needed better snow shedding and heat retention adopted the technique. Those satisfied with traditional methods continued building rectangular cabins. The terminology varied. Some called them cone cabins. Others referred to them as Reinhardt-style structures, naming them after Otto, though he never sought that recognition. A few called them mountain teepees, a term that acknowledged their resemblance to indigenous architecture, while recognizing they were built using European log construction methods. Otto never patented his design or attempted to profit from its spread. When asked years later why he had shared his techniques freely, he mentioned Wilhelm Kessler and said simply, "If it keeps someone else's roof from falling, then Wilhelm's death meant something." That was the entirety of his philosophy on the matter. He had solved a problem that cost his friend's life. Sharing that solution seemed obvious and necessary. Otto Reinhardt died in 1903 at the age of 58 of pneumonia that developed after a winter illness. His obituary in the territorial newspaper mentioned his ranching operation and his family, but made no reference to his cabin innovation. To the broader world, he was simply another settler who had lived and died on the frontier. But in the mountains, scattered across valleys and ridges, the distinctive conical structures remained. They stood through blizzards that buried rectangular cabins. They shed snow that would have crushed conventional roofs. They kept inhabitants warm with half the firewood. They were physical proof that observation, careful thought, and willingness to depart from tradition could solve problems that tradition could not. Otto's legacy was not written in books or recorded in official histories. It was built into logs and angles, standing silent testimony to what one man's grief and determination had created.